Hi, Miss Casey at home. I put a pretty background in there for you since, I don't know, it's Miss Casey. I think about you. I just am going to start reading to you, try and do it weekly. So it's up to you whether or not you listen or not, but I have wanted to read this book, so I'm reading it. So, sixth graders, remember, um, we've only gotten I don't think we've read for very long. We're on chapter 4. And the first three, it's about a girl who's an orphan and she needed to do some volunteering. So she's volunteering for an old lady. And I think that old lady was an orphan too. So I'm pretty sure that's where we're at. Don't worry, I have my coffee and I will stay energized for at least 20 minutes, hopefully. All right, Orphan Train, Chapter 4. Molly, Spruce Harbor, Maine, present day. Molly is sitting with her social worker at a table in the school science lab. All the other kids are eating lunch in the cafeteria, but Molly, lucky girl, gets to eat with Lori every Tuesday. So, how's the community service going? Lori asks. She has bright eyes like shiny buttons and a small pointy nose that, as far as Molly's concerned, she likes to stick in Molly's business. Molly shrugs. She unwraps the sandwich Dinah packed for her, a slice of bologna between two pieces of limp white bread. Lori picks up the salad she packed in a Tupperware container. I'll take that as an okay. But Molly, you've really got to make an effort there. No more problems, okay? We want things to go smoothly for you for a while. It's not like Molly goes looking for problems. She'd love for everything to go smoothly for a while. It just never seems to work out that way. She peels apart the sandwich, pulls the bologna out of the middle, and leans over to drop it in a garbage can next to the table. You don't like bologna? Lori asks. I'm a vegetarian, Molly says. Really? When did you decide that? A few weeks ago. She'd been thinking about it for a while, but an online video about chicken farms convinced her. Have you told Mrs. Theodore? Yeah. Molly puts the pieces of bread back together, picks up her sandwich of nothing, and takes a bite. Of course she told Dinah. It hasn't stopped her from packing Molly a bologna sandwich every day. Hmm. Lori flips open a folder on her desk. How are your classes going? Molly shrugs again. Lori taps a pencil on a sheet of paper inside the folder. There's a note from your language arts teacher. What'd she say? She said she'd love for you to participate more in class. You haven't raised your hand once. Maybe you could give that a try. What do you think? Molly mushes the rest of the soft white bread into a ball and stuffs it into her mouth so she doesn't have to answer. The truth is, she doesn't see the point of participating in class. Except for Jack, nobody really cares what she has to say anyway. She's just that weird goth girl, even to her foster mother. Molly touches her necklace with its three charms, a blue and green fish, a pewter raven, and a tiny brown bear. She remembers the night her dad gave them to her and wishes that right now the charms would give her some kind of encouragement, some feeling of strength. You can get through this, or maybe a warning. Leave the science lab and run for it. But the charms feel like nothing. She can't even sense their weight against her skin. Lori waits to see if Molly is going to say anything, then she sighs and flips her folder shut. Just stay out of trouble, Molly, okay? Molly pulls a red delicious apple out of her lunch bag. It's a little soft to the touch and smells too sweet, like apples do when they're about to go bad. She takes a big bite, waiting for this time with Lori to be done. Coffee break. And I gotta clean my glasses off. Sorry for the interruption, kiddos. Hope your quarantine time is going well. I miss you. Mrs. Cat. Okay, Neum, New York City in 1929. Mrs. Scatherd and Mr. Curran walked up and down the line, making sure that the children were all lined up by height, shortest to tallest. The babies were handed to girls older than 8. Mrs. Scatherd pushed a toddler into Neum's arms, an olive-skinned, slightly cross-eyed boy who seemed to be a few months younger than Maisie. Her name is Carmen. His name is Carmen, and he will be your charge, she said. Brown suitcase in one hand, Carmen in the other. Niam climbed unsteadily into the high step that led into the train, wobbling until Mr. Curran scurried over to take the bag. Use some common sense, girl, he scolded. If you fall, you'll crack both your skulls, and then we'll have to leave the two of you behind. Niam found a seat inside the train, a bench long enough for her and Carmen to spread out, and Mr. Curran heaved her suitcase up on the track over her head. Mrs. Scathard stood at the front of the car, holding on to the leather backs of two seats, the arms of her black cape draping like the wings of a crow. They call this an orphan train, children, she said, in a shrill voice, and you are lucky to be on it. You are leaving behind the big city, an evil place full of ignorance, poverty, and vice. You are on your way to healthy and virtuous life in the country. Niam had lived in both the city and the country, and it never struck her that one was more honorable than the other. She bounced Carmen up and down on her lap. While you are on this train, you will follow me some simple rules, Mrs. Scathard went on. You will listen to instructions. You will not wander off alone at any time. And if your behavior proves to be a problem, you will be sent straight back to where you came from and left to fend for yourselves. Niam looked around at the faces of her fellow train riders. She knew some of the children from the time she'd spent at the Children's Aid Society. Others were strangers. The younger ones she saw were wide-eyed and anxious and a little bewildered, as if worried that they might commit some dreadful sin without meaning to. The older ones looked like they were barely listening. Many of them had been at the Children's Aid for much longer than Niam. Some had come there from other orphanages. They'd probably heard plenty of speeches like this before. Carmen started to whine, kicking his feet against Niam's leg. He was hungry, she guessed. They'd only had a dry piece of bread and a tiny cup of milk for breakfast, and that was hours ago. But Niam knew better than to ask when food would be coming. During her time in the orphanage, she'd learned that food came when adults were ready to pass it out and not before. At breakfast that morning, she'd managed to drop 2 sugar lumps into her pocket. Now she crushed one between her fingers and licked her index finger to make the grain stick. She slipped the finger into Carmen's mouth. The look of astonished delight on his face made her smile. After sucking her finger, Carmen seemed to relax. He clutched Niam's hand with both of his chubby ones, holding on tight, and drifted off to sleep as the train started to move. Soon enough, Niam slept too. She woke when they stopped at a depot. Through sleepy eyes, she watched Mr. Curran get off. She could see him outside her window, talking to farmers on the platform. One held a basket of apples, one a sackful of bread. A man in a black apron reached into a box and unwrapped a package of brown paper to reveal a thick yellow slab of cheese, and Niam's stomach rumbled. Mr. Curran got back on the train and it pulled out of the station. After a few minutes, Niam saw a paper airplane winging above his head. Mr. Curran leaped to his feet and wheeled around. Who did that? He demanded, but no one confessed. Slowly he sat down. Then, from behind his back, someone let out a deafening belch. Mr. Curran jumped up again. Scoundrels! More belches came from various benches, and one girl gave a high-pitched, ghostly moan. Giggles burst out as Mr. Curran looked around wildly. Niam put her face in Carmen's hair to hide her smile. Mr. Curran could not pick out one child to punish. I'll send you all off this train at the next stop, he bellowed, standing in the aisle, gripping 2 seat backs for balance. I'd be glad to make my way on my own. One of the older boys shot back. He had bold blue eyes under a flannel cap that was also blue, and he met Mr. Curran's gaze with defiance. Been doing it for years. I reckon I can shine shoes in any city in America. It's probably better than being sent to live in a barn with animals eating pig slops. Children murmured in their seats. I hear will be sold at auction to the highest bidder, another boy whispered loudly. The car grew silent. Mrs. Scathard, who had been silently watching all the commotion, stood up. In her black cloak and steel-rimmed glasses, she was far more frightening than Mr. Curran. I have heard enough, she snapped. Mr. Curran, maybe the young man who spoke to you so impudently should be moved to a new seat. She lifted her chin, peering out from her bonnet like a turtle from its shell. Ah, there's a space over there, she said, pointing a finger in Niam's direction. Niam's skin prickled, but she could see that Mrs. Scathard meant what she had said. So she slid as close as she could to the window. She set Carmen in the middle, a barrier between herself and this stranger. The boy stood, pulled his bright blue cap down hard on his head, and dragged his feet up the aisle. He flung himself into the seat beside Carmen, then took his cap back off and slapped it against the seat in front. A small cloud of dust floated up. Man, he murmured, what an old goat. Then he held his finger out to Carmen, who buried his head in Niam's lap. Don't get you nowhere being shy, the boy said, glancing at Niam. He said, a redhead, that's worse than a boot black. Who's gonna want you? Niam's heart dropped. Hadn't those women in the train platform said the same thing? But she lifted her chin. At least I'm not a criminal. He laughed. That's what I am I? You tell me. Would you believe me? Probably not. No point then, is there? Liam didn't answer, and they sat in silence. Outside the window, gray clouds hung low in a watery sky. They took my kit from me, the boy said after a while. Liam turned to look at him. What? My boot black kit. All my paste and brushes. How do they expect me to make a living? They don't. They're going to find you a family. You think so, huh? He said. A ma to tuck us in at night and a pa to put food on the table? I don't see it working out like that, do you? I don't know. Haven't thought about it, she said, though it was all she could think about. Well, I have, he said. Over the next few hours, the boy told Liam his story. His name was Hans, but everybody called him Dutchy. His mother died of pneumonia, and his father sent him out into the streets to earn money as a bootblack, beating him with a belt if he didn't bring back enough. So one day he stopped going home. He fell in with a gang of boys on the streets, and they looked after one another as much as they could. He taught himself piano by ear in the back room of a speakeasy where people crept in to order beer and whiskey. They couldn't buy in the light of day, not since the law changed. And then someone from the Children's Aid Society came by and promised him a hot meal if he came inside, and he ended up here sitting beside Niam on this train full of orphans. When Carmen began to fuss, Dutchy reached into his pocket and pulled out a penny. He rolled it across his fingers, held it between his thumb and forefingers, touched it to Carmen's nose, and then clasped it in his closed fist. When he opened his hand, the penny wasn't there. He reached behind Carmen's ear and presto, Dutchy said. Carmen gazed at the bright coin between Dutchy's fingers, astonished. Dutchy grinned at Niam and tucked the coin back into his pocket. Who knows what'll happen to us? If it's bad, we just have to put up with it, or maybe we'll get lucky and live happily ever after. Only the good Lord knows what's next, and he ain't telling. Chapter 5. Molly. Spruce Harbor, Maine, present day. Molly is sitting at the desk in her room doing math. The only thing on the surface of her desk is her textbook and a sheet of lined paper. She opens her desk drawer and reaches in to find a pencil sharpener, neatly set alongside a packet of yellow post-its, a row of unsharpened pencils, 3 ballpoint pens, and a stapler. She gives her pencil a perfect point. Jack, who's sitting on the floor by Molly's bed with the textbook open on his knees, snorts. Molly looks over at him. What? That's the third time you've sharpened your pencil since you started your homework. So? Molly glowers at him. She likes her pencil sharp. What's wrong with that? Her numbers look neater that way. Jack puts up a hand as if to shield himself from her glare. Dinah passes by in the hall and looks in suspiciously. Only if the door is wide open, she said when Molly asked if Jack could come over and study with her after school. He's not my boyfriend, Molly said, just a friend. Wide open, Dinah said, or he's not coming. Okay, okay. When Molly told Jack what Dinah had said, he shrugged. I get it. Moms can be annoying. She's not my mom, Molly snapped. Jack just laughed. I think you both need to chill out a little bit. Molly met Jack her first week here in language arts. They'd been assigned to a writing group along with Jody Davis. Jody tucked a strand of long, taffy-colored hair behind her ear and stared at Molly. That girl is weird, Molly heard her whisper to Jack. She freaks me out. Jack didn't do what Molly expected. He didn't laugh at Molly or exchange an I know, right? Look with Jody. He just shrugged. Then, when Jody looked away, he glanced at Molly, ran a finger down his own hair where the blue streak was in hers, and grinned. Molly tugs at the blue streak, remembering. In between math problems, she's been sketching a shape on the edge of her paper, a circle the size of a quarter, with four legs, a head, and a tail. Now she begins to draw in a tiny tight pattern on the turtle shell. Hey, what's that? Molly looks up, startled. She'd become so interested in her drawing that she hadn't noticed Jack closing his book or coming to stand over her. Instinctively, she covers the turtle with her hand, but Jack's already seen it. Cool, what's his name? Doesn't have a name. I think you should call him Carlos. What? Despite herself, Molly begins to smile. She takes her hand away and studies the turtle. Why Carlos? He just looks like a Carlos. See his little head? He's kind of wagging it like, what's up? He's a chill dude. Jack perches on the edge of her desk. So, how's it going with Mrs. Daly? Vivian? Molly folds the sheet of math problems in half and puts it away in her textbook, turtle and all. Oh, I don't know. She's all up in my business. Like how? I don't know anything about her life. Oh, except she said that one of her teachers when she was in school was named Miss Larson. Not like I care. But she expects me to tell her everything about mine. What does she need to know for? Maybe she's lonely living in the big house all by herself. My mom is the only one she talks to. Molly frowns. Well, I don't need to tell her stories about my sad life. We can't all be rich and live in mansions. So turn it around. Ask her questions. Like what? Like whatever, Jack says. You're going through all those boxes, right? So ask some questions about what she's kept up there all these years. Like, why turtles? Molly looks at him as if he's lost his mind. He nods at her notebook. Why turtles? See, that's how you ask people questions. You like them. Are you asking me? He nods. Turtles, they mean something in my culture. Like what? Why should she answer him, or Vivian, or Lori? Dinah walks by the room for a second time and stares at him, and he ignores her. He's just sitting there looking at Molly, smiling a little. He actually seems to want to know about the turtles. Molly opens her notebook again and looks at Carlos. Turtles carry their homes on their backs, she tells Jack, remembering what her dad told her years ago. She repeats his words as best she can. They're out there in the world for anyone to see, but hidden at the same time. They're strong, they're slow, but they get where they're going. They don't give up. She draws another turtle next to Carlos, a little smaller with a different pattern on its shell. Jack sits next to her quietly, watching her pencil on the paper. It's funny sitting at her desk with Jack, with Dinah pacing back and forth in the hall outside like she's on patrol. Molly feels exposed and protected all at once. Yeah, that's right, like a turtle in a shell. Ugh, coffee breaks are the best. Neum, Chicago, Illinois, 1929. On the third day the train crossed the Illinois state line. Neum felt stiff and sore from all the hours on the hard bench. Restless and tired at once, and amazed by the sheer size of the United States. She'd known the country was big, but she had no idea how big. They had been traveling for days and were barely in the middle yet. Near Chicago, Mrs. Scathard stood for another lecture. In a few minutes we will arrive at Union Station, where we'll switch trains for the next portion of our journey, she told the children. We are not allowed to board for an hour, so we will wait on the platform. Quietly. Young men, put on your suit coats. Young ladies, your pinafores. Chicago is a proud and noble city on the edge of a great lake. The lake makes it windy, which is why it's called the Windy City. You will bring your suitcases, of course, and will want to put on your coats. Mr. Curran and I expect you to conduct yourselves like the model citizens the Children's Aid Society believes you can become. Mrs. Scathard was right. When Neum stepped off the train, the wind on the platform rushed through her pinafore and her dress. She dug her too small coat out of her suitcase and stuffed her arms into the sleeves, but it was impossible to fasten the buttons. Carmen staggered around, happy to have room to roam, while Neum kept a sharp eye on him. He wanted to know the name of everything he saw. Train, wheel, lights. They were a quiet lot, even the older boys, who were huddled together, stamping their feet to keep warm. Except for Dutchy, Neem realized. Where did he go? Neem. When she heard her name, she turned to glimpse his blond head at the foot of a staircase across the platform. Neem looked over at the adults. Mr. Scathard was frowning at a conductor. Mr. Curran was poring over papers with a station agent. A large rat scurried along a brick wall a little way down the platform. As the other children pointed and shrieked, Neem scooped Carmen up and slipped behind a pillar and a pile of wooden crates. On the stairwell, Dutchy leaned against a wall. When he saw Neem, he turned and bounded up the stairs, vanishing around a corner. Neem held Carmen tightly and followed. She knew perfectly well that she shouldn't be doing this, and she told herself she only wanted to find Dutchy to make him come back. But for the first time since the dreadful night when she had lost her family, something flickered inside her. It was quiet happiness. Excuse Miss Casey. And it wasn't quite hope, but it might have been curiosity. What was at the top of the staircase? What did Chicago look like beyond this one platform? Carmen tilted his head up and leaned back in her arms, floppy as a sack of rice. Yite, he murmured, pointing, following his gaze. She saw that just up ahead was the enormous ceiling of the train station laced with skylights. They stepped into the huge terminal filled with people. There were wealthy women in furs, trailed by servants, men in top hats and morning coats, shop girls in bright dresses. Dutchy was standing in the middle, looking up at the sky through the huge panes of glass, with a huge grin on his face. Suddenly he took off his cap and flung it into the air. Carmen struggled in Niam's arms, and when she set him down, he raced toward Dutchy and grabbed his legs. Dutchy reached down and hoisted the baby onto his shoulders. He clasped Carmen's legs and began to twirl. Carmen stretched out his arms and threw back his head, shrieking with glee, and that flicker inside Niam sharpened and brightened into joy. Joy so sharp it felt like the edge of a knife. Even though it hurt, she hugged the feeling tightly. It was nothing she'd ever experienced before, and she didn't know if she'd ever feel it again. A whistle blasted through the air. Niam spun around, trying to see where the sound had come from. She spotted 3 policemen in dark uniforms racing toward Dutchy and Carmen. Mrs. Scathard had climbed the stairs from the platform. She raised her black wing, pointing toward the 2 boys. Mr. Curran pushed past her. Dutchy froze. Carmen grabbed his hair and shrieked. Just then, someone seized hold of Niam's arms. Another policeman. Trying to get away, were ya? He hissed in her ear, his breath smelling of licorice. Liam twisted in his grasp, trying to see what had happened to Dutchy. He was face down on the ground now, the policemen surrounding him. Carmen was on the ground as well, sitting beside Dutchy, crying and bewildered. Liam tried to go to him, but the policeman yanked her back. Then another policeman hauled Dutchy roughly to his feet. They were both dragged over to Mrs. Scathard. A third policeman carried Carmen. "These are your young charges, ma'am?" one of the policemen asked. Mrs. Scathard nodded. "Unfortunately, they are." She looked as if she'd bitten into a lime. "I placed this young man with you," she said to Niam in a quietly terrible voice, "in the hope that you might prove a civilizing influence. It appears that I was gravely mistaken." Niam wanted to tell her that Dutchy didn't mean any harm, that she didn't either. They both of them just wanted to see what it was at the top of the stairwell, that they just wanted to spin and laugh under the bright sky. "No, ma'am, do not interrupt." Niam looked down. "Now, what do you have to say for yourself?" "I'm sorry." Niam knew that Mrs. Scathard was not going to approve of her, never again, but maybe she could still save Dutchy. If Mrs. Scathard sent him off the train here in Chicago, what would he do? He didn't have his bootblack kit. He couldn't make money for himself. "I asked Hans, to take me and the baby into the station," she told Mrs. Scathard. "I thought maybe we could get a glimpse of that lake. I thought the baby would like to see it." Mrs. Scathard glared at her. Dutchy looked startled, but said nothing. Carmen said, "Yake!" Mrs. Scathard's face softened. "You are a foolish and headstrong girl," she told Niam, but her voice had lost its edge, and Niam could tell that she wasn't as angry as she wanted to appear. "You disobeyed my instructions. You've disgraced yourself." She turned to the officers in their uniforms. "But this is not, I think, a matter for the police." The officer holding Dutchie let him go. Molly, Spruce Harbor, Maine, present day. After Jack has packed up his backpack and gone home, Dinah calls from the kitchen that dinner is ready. So, how's that community service working out? Ralph asks when Molly gets to the table. He pours himself a big glass of milk. Fine, Molly says. She picks up a piece of corn on the cob from a platter in the center of the table and plucks a hot dog gingerly from the bun on her plate. She sets the meat quietly to one side. There's lots of stuff in that attic. 20 hours worth, asked Dinah. I guess there's other things I can do if we finish the attic, Molly says. That house is huge. Yeah, sure is. I know the house. I've done some plumbing work over there, Ralph said. Old Pipes is Jack's mom, usually there when you're working. Is Jack's mom usually there when you're working? Molly nods. She's around doing laundry and stuff. Dinah gives her a funny smile. Terry Gallant doing laundry? Now there's a picture. Molly looks at her in confusion. Come on, Dinah, Ralph says mildly. Dinah ignores him. Back in high school, Terry Gallant was Miss Popular, homecoming queen, and all that, she tells Molly. Now she's scrubbing floors, huh? Molly turns her attention to her food. When she's done, she picks up her plate with the hot dog still on it. She remembers to thank Dinah for dinner. Neum, Chicago, Illinois, 1929. By the time they left Chicago, it was evening. As the train chugged out of the station, Mrs. Scatcherd rapped Dutchie's knuckles several times with the long wooden ruler as punishment for leaving the platform. He barely winced, then shook his hands twice in the air and winked at Neum. Carmen sat in Neum's lap, face pressed against the window, gazing out at the streets and buildings all lit up. Yikes, he said softly as Dutchie flopped onto the seat beside him. Get a good night's rest, children, Mrs. Scatcherd called from the front of the car. In the morning we'll be making our first stop. You will need to be at your very best if you want to be chosen by a kind family. What if nobody wants me? One boy asked, and the entire car seemed to hold its breath. Mrs. Scatcherd looked as if she'd been waiting for this. If it happens that you are not chosen at the first stop, there will be several later chances. I cannot think of a time. She paused. It is very rare for a child to be with us on the return trip to New York. Pardon me, ma'am, a girl near the front said. What if I don't want to go with the people who choose me? What if they're mean? A younger boy cried out. Children, Mrs. Scatcherd's glasses flashed as she turned her head from side to side. I will not have you interrupting. But was she going to answer the questions or not? Everybody had their eyes on hers. I will say this, she looked sterner than ever. Some parents are looking for a healthy boy to work on the farm. Some people want babies. Parents sometimes think they want one thing, but later change their minds. We dearly hope all of you will find the right home at the first stop, but it doesn't always work out that way. Be respectful, polite, and keep your faith in God. Whether your journey is long or short, He will help you as long as you place your trust in Him. Neum looked at Dutchie. Mrs. Scatcherd hadn't really answered the question, but the message was clear. Mrs. Scatcherd did not know any more than the children knew whether they'd be treated with kindness. This train was taking them steadily into the unknown, and they had no choice but to sit quietly in their hard seats and let themselves be taken there. So that's chapter 5, and I think I'll leave it there. And then next time I'll read chapter 6, maybe. Bye, guys.